They thought no one would notice until a single man raised the alarm. It started as just another hot, windless evening along the West African border, where sand clings to skin and silence holds secrets. But what happened on that night would change the fate of a nation and shake the conscience of a continent. In a place most maps forget, under the cover of darkness, something moved that wasn't supposed to. A convoy of trucks, 47 in total, emerged from nothingness like a mirage, headlights off, moving slow, deliberate, and secretive. No radio chatter, no military escort, no explanation. These weren't aid trucks. They weren't relief vehicles. And the labels on their cargo? Lie. On the Togo-Burkina Faso border, Captain Amadou Yeo was nearing the end of his shift when he spotted the strange line of vehicles approaching from the east. Something didn't sit right. He radioed for confirmation. None had been granted passage. These trucks had no scheduled clearance. That's when he made the decision that would later make him either a hero or a target. He blocked the road. The drivers hesitated. Some argued, others simply froze. But before long, soldiers arrived. When the rear doors of the first truck were opened, silence fell. Instead of food supplies or water filtration units, crates of military-grade weapons gleamed under the flashlight beams. AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, tactical vests, night vision goggles, and ammunition by the ton. The kind of firepower you don't find in humanitarian convoys. The kind of arsenal you only move if you're planning to take something by force. Calls went out to the capital. Within hours, President Ibrahim Traoré had deployed elite security forces to secure every vehicle. No shots fired, no one escaped. Every truck, every box, every bullet was now in state custody. But the real story was only beginning. As investigators combed through the contents of each truck, they discovered that serial numbers had been removed, and in some cases, weapon parts were intentionally misassembled. Methods often used by foreign intelligence operations to mask origin. Forensics teams worked through the night. What they found pointed far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Documents recovered from hidden compartments referenced code names, transfer orders, and unusually large bank transactions routed through offshore accounts. One name kept coming up: Project Savannah. None of the arrested drivers had any knowledge of the cargo. Most claimed they were hired anonymously, paid in cash, and told to follow GPS instructions. A few cried during questioning. One reportedly whispered, "We thought it was fertilizer." As the information reached the President's Security Council, a picture began to form. A terrifying one. These weren't stolen weapons or black market trades. They were part of an organized pipeline designed to arm dissidents within Burkina Faso and possibly surrounding nations. The target? The government. The system? The people. President Traoré addressed his generals. "We are not under attack by bandits. This is an invasion without uniforms." His words carried the weight of history, because if there is one lesson Africa has learned over the centuries, it's that not all wars begin with a declaration. Some arrive in silence, buried in aid boxes. By morning, the story broke. Citizens awoke to the shocking images: rows of weapon-laden trucks, guarded by soldiers, lined up along the desert highway like a convoy to nowhere. Panic was avoided, but anger spread. People demanded to know who sent these weapons and why. The more investigators dug, the darker the truth became. The operation wasn't local. It wasn't spontaneous. It had been carefully engineered, funded, and timed. Intelligence briefings poured into the president's office. Some whispered, others screamed. The recovered documents revealed shipping logs dating back months, tied to NGOs operating under the guise of development projects. Several warehouses across Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso were suddenly under surveillance. In 17 of them, matching ammunition crates were discovered, identical to those in the trucks, and then came the names. Among them were former ministers, corporate executives, 2 retired generals, and a prominent TV news anchor. All were Burkinabe. All had sworn loyalty to the state, and all were found in secret communication with foreign agents. It wasn't just an external invasion, it was a betrayal from within one encrypted message, decrypted by national cybersecurity teams. Reads simply, "Phase 2 begins when cargo is distributed." That phase never came. But what it would have unleashed, civil unrest, coordinated riots, maybe even a coup, was stopped just in time. President Traoré went public. His voice was calm, but the words were fire. To those who sought to burn our house down while smiling in our living rooms, he said, know this, we are awake now. Citizens flooded the streets, not in case, but in unity. Flags were raised, markets stayed open. Students wore black bands to school in silent protest. Farmers, teachers, drivers, street vendors, they all spoke of one thing: who tried to sell our country. As pressure mounted, neighboring governments began issuing cautious statements. Some distanced themselves, others offered quiet cooperation. But one pattern was undeniable. Several of the weapons matched those used in Middle Eastern conflicts: Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Their route, Eastern Europe, rerouted through NGOs, landing in West Africa as infrastructure support. International watchdogs, once reluctant to challenge certain donor nations, began publishing reports. The titles were chilling: Weapons Disguised as Aid, Africa's Quiet War, How the Sahel Became a Proxy Battleground. Back in Burkina Faso, arrests continued. Evidence was overwhelming: bank statements, intercepted calls, even drone footage showing weapons being offloaded near a private estate outside the capital. Among those detained was a former ambassador. His home was found to contain encrypted phones and files marked "Confidential Transition Strategy." When confronted, he reportedly said, "We were told this was the only way to stabilize the region." Traoré responded simply, "Stability does not come in crates of bullets." A special tribunal was convened. Trials would be public, transparent. Every citizen would have the right to watch the process unfold. "This is not about revenge," said the Minister of Justice. "This is about truth." As the news spread beyond Africa, global media began catching up. Questions surfaced in parliaments and senates. How did these weapons get here? Who authorized the shipments? And why were Western-aligned NGOs implicated? But for the people of Burkina Faso, the focus wasn't just on who tried to bring war, but on how they would build peace from its ashes, from dust to defiance. How the people reclaimed their voice. The days that followed were unlike anything Burkina Faso had seen since its independence. Not because of fear, but because of clarity. Across dusty roads and narrow alleyways, people began to organize. Not in violence, but in purpose. Youth groups held nightly forums where elders told stories of past betrayals, and students took notes not just for exams, but for history. Neighborhoods repainted walls once tagged with foreign-funded slogans. New words replaced them: sovereignty, unity, legacy. It wasn't just slogans that changed, it was the spirit. Something had shifted. A fire that had long been dimmed was now ablaze. For the first time in decades, Burkinabe citizens weren't asking what outsiders would do for them. They were asking what they would no longer allow. Across social media, a movement spread. We Are Burkina became a digital bonfire. Images of the intercepted trucks, overlaid with captions like "Not in our name," flooded timelines. Mothers posted photos of their children beside repurposed bullet casings made into bracelets, sold to fund village clinics. Artists painted murals of President Traoré holding a broken rifle, turned upside down like a plow, and then came the schools. From the melted scrap of those 47 trucks, the first delivery was made not to a military depot, but to a rural classroom. The desks were made from steel once meant to destroy. The chairs bore engraving plates, reclaimed by the people. When the first school bell rang, cast from a disarmed mortar shell, children stood with their hands on their hearts. Not out of routine, out of reverence. Traoré made no speech that day. He didn't need to. The medal spoke for itself. Internationally, reactions were split. Some praised the transformation, others feared it. Pundits on Western news channels described Burkina Faso's rise as nationalist, confrontational, even dangerously independent. But on the ground, the people laughed at such labels. "Is planting your own food now considered rebellion?" one farmer joked on national radio. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from abroad. Development contracts were quietly suspended. Banking access was restricted. Diplomats whispered warnings. "You're isolating yourself," they said, but Traoré held firm. "We are not isolated," he replied. "We are insulated from corruption." That phrase became a banner. Regional leaders began reaching out. Guinea's president sent a delegation. Mali's leadership pledged intelligence sharing. Even nations once distant expressed interest in what was now being called the Ouagadougou Doctrine, a commitment to sovereignty through self-reliance. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about what it represented, a mirror to a continent too long forced to bend. And now, finally, someone had said no. Not with anger, not with violence, but with action. And action would be what came next. Steel forged into future, turning weapons into tools of peace with the world watching and the nation united. President Traoré made a bold declaration. "The weapons meant to destroy us will now build us," he said, and he meant every word. The government launched the Steel for Schools initiative, repurposing over 80% of the confiscated arms into educational infrastructure. Engineers, blacksmiths, and students all joined forces. Each melted rifle became part of a desk, a hospital bed, a bridge beam. From destruction, creation. From sabotage, rebirth. In the small town of Koudougou, villagers gathered as the first classroom built from reclaimed steel was opened. It had no gold trim, no marble steps, but the floor was swept, the walls were strong, and the windows faced the morning sun. "This school," said a local elder, "was born from the fire they sent to burn us." Even international observers couldn't ignore what was happening. Journalists from Al Jazeera, the Beeb, and Latin America's Telesur arrived to document the transformation. What they found wasn't a nation on edge, but one with resolve. "We are no longer waiting for help," a young woman told them. "We are building it ourselves." But the more Burkina Faso rose, the more resistance it faced from outside. Foreign financial institutions tightened restrictions. NGOs previously active in the country either froze operations or quietly left. Whispers of economic collapse began circling Western media, describing Traoré's government as reckless, populist, even militarized. Yet when local surveys were conducted, over 90% of Burkina Faso citizens said they had more trust in their leadership than ever before. Because trust in that moment was earned in steel. Meanwhile, across West Africa, the ripple effect spread. Mali announced its own plan to review all foreign military cooperation. Niger declared an investigation into NGO-linked supply chains. Guinea called for a regional summit to address external manipulation. These weren't coordinated actions. They were reflections of a shared awakening. Traoré responded by proposing the Sahel Sovereignty Accord, a framework for nations to jointly invest in border security, cybersecurity, and localized development without dependency on former colonial powers. Some called it naive, others called it overdue. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was necessary. "If we do not define our own security," Traoré said, "someone else will define it for us." And they already have, through weapons, through debt, and through silence. At home, artists turned resistance into renaissance. Musicians recorded protest songs using instruments made from bullet casings. Writers published poetry carved into melted steel plaques. One line became a national motto: "We do not carry arms, we carry memory." But perhaps the most powerful statement came not from a politician or soldier, but from a child. In a documentary filmed for global audiences, a 10-year-old girl was asked what she wanted to be when she grew up. She stood before a desk made from war metal and said softly, "I want to be the teacher who tells the story." That story, born from attempted destruction, had become the blueprint for renewal. The new battlefield: words, networks, and the currency of control. As Burkina Faso melted steel into desks, the real war moved into subtler terrain. It was no longer just about intercepted trucks or hidden arms. It was about stories, narratives, perception. And those too had always been weapons, used not with explosions, but with headlines and policy memos. Western outlets began airing panel discussions labeling Burkina Faso as unstable, its leadership unpredictable. Reports cited economic downturn risks, diplomatic fallout, and warnings from foreign investors. But none of those voices lived in the villages that now had water pumps built from rocket tube frames. None of them sat in the new classrooms where children learn not just math, but the meaning of sovereignty. President Traoré, aware of the shift, launched a counteroffensive, not through force, but through truth. A national media initiative was rolled out. Community radios began broadcasting real-time updates on the weapons investigation, corruption trials, and development projects. Citizens weren't being told what to think, they were being given the facts and trusted to think for themselves. The centerpiece of the effort was the launch of Burkina Vision, a state-supported but publicly governed media platform aimed at breaking the monopoly of external narratives. Its slogan was simple: "We speak for ourselves." And speak they did. Interviews with former drivers of the intercepted convoy revealed chilling details. They were misled, underpaid, and expendable. "We were just pieces," one of them said. They didn't care who we were, only where the weapons landed. This honesty shocked even the skeptics. People began to ask deeper questions. Who benefits from Africa staying weak? Why does independence always come with foreign conditions? And most importantly, what does real freedom even look like? Traoré's administration responded by implementing mandatory national history education, focused not only on colonial resistance, but on modern financial colonization. Students studied IMF conditionalities, development loan structures, and how humanitarian aid was often used as leverage. They weren't being radicalized. They were being educated. Simultaneously, Burkina Faso's economic team initiated talks with regional partners for a new West African payment settlement system, one not tied to the CFA franc or Western banking networks. The goal? Trade on equal terms, with currencies and rules made in Africa for Africa. Of course, backlash came swiftly. 3 major donor countries suspended development aid. One European official publicly stated, "They're biting the hand that feeds them." To which a Burkinabe farmer replied on live radio, "It wasn't food, it was a leash." That quote spread like wildfire. Memes, t-shirts, graffiti all carried the line. In markets, sellers painted it above their stalls. Children wrote it in chalk on blackboards. It was a leash. And just like that, the people turned propaganda into power. Elsewhere, a youth movement called the Black Soil Pact began across several Sahel nations. Their mission? Reclaim agricultural land, promote seed independence, and build rural economies immune to foreign seed patenting. Burkina Faso became the model. Its methods weren't always perfect, but they were honest, grounded, homegrown. The message was spreading not just through policy, but through pride. And though the challenges were far from over, a realization had settled in like red dust on old boots. This was not just survival, this was strategy. A continent responds, from isolation to inspiration. What began as a defensive act in Burkina Faso was rapidly transforming into a regional reckoning. In the months following the intercepted convoy, something remarkable happened. The silence that once surrounded African resistance began to break. And not through war, but through example. From Mali to Guinea, from Niger to Chad, a new wave of thought spread like rain on parched soil. Governments quietly reviewed foreign military contracts. Students hosted conferences with names like "Our Land, Our Law." Farmers rejected genetically modified seeds that came with legal bindings. Radio hosts, once cautious, now spoke openly. Burkina Faso has shown us what standing up looks like. Are we ready to stand too? But not everyone was inspired. In international boardrooms, the tone changed from disinterest to discomfort. Reports circulated within intelligence agencies about Pan-African sentiment rising dangerously. Some described it as contagious nationalism. Others called it resistance branding. Whatever the label, the outcome was clear. Africa was starting to question the terms of its partnerships, and some global powers weren't ready for that. At the UN, Burkina Faso's representative gave a speech that broke protocol. "We were told we were free," he said, "but our trade was dictated, our banks were watched, and our education came from someone else's books." The chamber fell silent, not because the words were aggressive, but because they were true. President Traoré, meanwhile, proposed a bold vision, the Sahel Sovereign Compact, a regional alliance focused on mutual defense, fair trade, and cultural preservation. No more outsourced security, no more pre-written development scripts, just shared resources, local innovation, and respect. Within weeks, Mali and Niger joined in. Guinea expressed interest. Even countries previously aligned with Western interests began asking questions. Can we build without begging? In response, economic retaliation came swiftly. Several West African nations saw sudden cuts to aid, restricted access to SWIFT transfers, and suspended trade talks. Sanctions were whispered under diplomatic smiles. One Western media outlet ran a headline, "Burkina Faso leads Africa into economic darkness." But in Ouagadougou, the streets were lit literally. Street lamps powered by new solar panels, built from melted weapon casings, began appearing in outer neighborhoods. Clinics received repurposed equipment. New wells opened in dry villages. People whispered to each other in markets. We may eat less now, but we are eating in our own house. Symbolism was everywhere. A former foreign embassy building, abandoned after diplomatic tensions, was converted into a school for journalism. Its slogan, "We write what we live." Cultural revival followed. Traditional storytelling returned to classrooms. Ancestral farming methods, once dismissed as primitive, were now part of the national curriculum under the title Sustainable Heritage. Artists created exhibitions made from surveillance tech captured from NGOs. One sculpture, a drone melted and reshaped into a baobab tree, was called We See You Now. International audiences began to pay attention. Documentaries aired, podcasts emerged. Activists in South America, Asia, and the Middle East drew parallels. What Traoré is doing, one political analyst noted, is not just African politics. It's a blueprint for dignity. But he also warned, dignity makes enemies. Inside Burkina Faso, that warning was taken seriously. Cybersecurity was reinforced. Independent fact-checking units were trained to identify misinformation campaigns. Citizen media literacy courses were rolled out. The people were not only building their country, they were protecting the story of how it was being built. Because they understood, narrative is infrastructure. And just like roads and bridges, if you don't build your own, someone else will tell you where to go. The blueprint emerges, from resistance to redesign. As the embers of chaos cooled and steel was reshaped into service, Burkina Faso did not simply rebuild, it began to reimagine. And in doing so, it issued an unspoken challenge to the rest of Africa. What if sovereignty was more than survival? What if it could be strategy? In the capital city, a new government task force unveiled a policy package called Vision 2040, a 15-year roadmap for economic independence. It included plans for national manufacturing, public internet infrastructure, digital archives of oral history, and a sovereign health initiative using traditional medicine integrated with modern science. Every sector, education, agriculture, security, energy, was included. It was not foreign-funded. It was crowd-funded, state-backed, and publicly debated. Each program had one guiding principle: no progress should cost your freedom. President Traoré presented the plan in a modest press room, not a grand hall. "We are not perfect," he said, "but we are present in our own story, in our own future. And for once, we are not reading the script. We are writing it." This resonated far beyond borders. From Kampala to Caracas, political thinkers began citing Burkina Faso as a case study. Even critics in Europe admitted, quietly, that the country's ability to pivot from chaos to vision was remarkably fast. One foreign journalist called it post-colonialism with a plan. But power does not shift easily. Multinational corporations, previously granted vast access to extractive industries, began to feel pressure. Burkinabe lawmakers proposed revised mining laws requiring transparency, profit sharing, and environmental guarantees. Resistance came fast, legal threats were issued. Foreign ambassadors requested emergency dialogue. Burkina Faso held firm. A new committee of legal scholars and village elders jointly reviewed every contract. "No pen will sign without the people's eyes on it," one elder declared. Meanwhile, digital warfare intensified. Fake news articles flooded platforms. Photoshopped images of Traoré in military uniforms were spread. claiming he planned to rule for life. International influencers mocked the idea of melting weapons into school bells, calling it sentimental propaganda. The government didn't censor. Instead, they educated. New media literacy campaigns were launched in schools and community centers. Ask who benefits from the story, posters read. Ask who wrote it. Journalists were trained not just in reporting, but in resisting manipulation. The resistance now had layers: physical, cultural, psychological. And as those layers deepened, allies strengthened. Mali and Niger began implementing similar education reforms. Guinea adopted Burkina Faso's model of community development audits. A joint commission of Sahel nations announced plans for the region's first independent data center, free from foreign surveillance and built using repurposed technology seized during prior operations. This wasn't isolationism, it was architecture, and the foundation was dignity. For decades, Africa had been told what stability looked like, usually from podiums far from the continent. But here, on red soil and under harsh sun, a new model was taking shape. One not focused on GDP rankings or foreign credit ratings, but on how many children were fed, how many wells were built, and how many decisions were made without foreign permission. And the world noticed a surprise headline appeared in a major American publication. What if Burkina Faso is right? The article didn't offer conclusions, but it asked the questions that mattered. If a nation can stop a foreign-funded coup, repurpose the weapons, reject exploitative contracts, and still educate, feed, and unite its people, then why does the world fear it? Shouldn't it be applauded? The response was mixed, but inside Burkina Faso there was no confusion. Applause wasn't the goal. Autonomy was because applause fades, but sovereignty, that stays. Echoes beyond borders. When a nation speaks, a diaspora answers. As the flames of transformation rose inside Burkina Faso, their light reached far beyond its borders. Across oceans and time zones, a quiet stirring began, among people who no longer lived on African soil but still carried its memory in their names, their skin, their dreams. In Atlanta, a community center held a screening of a documentary on the intercepted trucks. A woman stood at the end and whispered, "My grandfather was born in Ouagadougou. I thought he left a broken place. Maybe he left a waiting place." In Paris, descendants of Burkinabe immigrants marched silently through the city, holding signs with a single phrase. They melted the rifles. Around them, traffic stopped. People watched, and no one laughed. In Brazil, a samba group composed a drum line that mimicked the sound of a school bell ringing, cast from a warhead turned to peace. The rhythm echoed through carnival streets, reminding everyone that joy itself can be resistance. Burkina Faso's voice had become more than news. It had become song, sculpture, sermon, a reminder to the African diaspora that dignity was not something you waited for. It was something you built, even with broken things. And back home, the momentum didn't stop. A traveling exhibition was launched, From Steel to Story. It featured classroom furniture made from weapon parts, original intelligence documents behind glass, audio recordings of villagers who witnessed the convoy's interception. The exhibit traveled from city to village, stopping even in remote settlements where electricity was scarce, but pride was abundant. At each stop, there was a moment of silence. Then a bell rang, replicas of the first school bell forged after the weapons were seized. Children rang it, elders blessed it, and visitors wept. "We ring not for the war that didn't happen," said a guide, "but for the peace we chose instead." Meanwhile, global institutions shifted from criticism to curiosity. Panels were held at major universities. The Sahel model, sovereignty without supervision. White papers were drafted. Diplomats asked for meetings. Some were sincere, others were strategic. But Burkina Faso welcomed both with caution and clarity. "We are not here to impress," said one official. "We are here to endure." Inside the country, that endurance had become culture. Music charts were topped by artists singing about soil, truth, and the dignity of simplicity. One hit song began with the line, "They came with lies, we gave them light." Traoré's administration began exporting the model, not as policy but as principle. Free training courses were offered to neighboring countries on legal self-auditing, data protection, and youth leadership. If we can do it, Traoré said in a televised interview, so can others. We are not special. We are simply awake. And yet, even in victory, challenges remained. Weather patterns continued to affect harvests. Global economic shifts tightened trade access. Not every community was fully rebuilt. Not every citizen agreed on every policy. But unlike before, no one waited for someone else to fix it. Farmers cooperated across regions. Women's groups created their own microbanks. Teachers walked miles to deliver handwritten curriculum where textbooks were scarce, and they did it without being told they were behind. Because they finally understood, the goal was never to catch up to someone else's standard. It was to rise on their own terms. The system on trial, when the silent refused to stay quiet, it was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. What began as a midnight convoy seized on a dusty road had become a question posed to the entire world. Who controls the future of Africa? And why had the truth been buried under so many layers of aid, diplomacy, and silence? At the International Forum on Sovereign Development held in Addis Ababa, leaders from across the global south gathered, not as guests, but as equals. Traoré addressed them with a calm force that belied the weight of what was at stake. They say we are destabilizing the region, he said. But what is more destabilizing, seizing weapons meant for our destruction, or pretending those weapons were never sent? The crowd responded not with applause, but with nods, because they knew. They had seen it too. Burkina Faso presented its evidence. Detailed logs, financial trails, intercepted communications, all tracing back to institutions and governments that once claimed neutrality. The documents were not accusations. They were facts. And facts are difficult to dismiss, even behind the polished desks of foreign ministries. Some nations were quick to deflect. It was unauthorized actors, they said, contractors misbehaving. But the paper trails didn't lie. Shell companies in Luxembourg, foundations registered in Delaware, aid organizations whose offices shared addresses with arms logistics firms. This wasn't an accident, it was architecture. And Burkina Faso wasn't just exposing it, they were offering an alternative. The Sahel Sovereignty Pact, once dismissed as symbolic, now gained traction. 5 more nations joined. A continental legal framework was proposed to require full disclosure of all foreign contracts. Media platforms united to create a trans-African press consortium, reducing reliance on Western news wires. Even diaspora banks began opening micro-branches back home to support locally driven investment. One proposal struck a nerve globally, the Debt Reclamation Initiative, which called on former colonial powers to open archives on post-independence loan agreements and reclassify exploitative debt as illegitimate. The international response was swift: panic, protests, and in some cases, ridicule. But Burkina Faso did not flinch. They released a full national audit of their historical debt. Page after page showed how development loans had come with military advisors, how infrastructure grants were tied to natural resource contracts, how support had often meant surveillance. The public reaction was stunning. People flooded government buildings, not in outrage but in volunteering. Engineers offered to work at half salary on infrastructure built without foreign strings. Professors rewrote economics textbooks. Even prisoners serving nonviolent sentences petitioned to contribute to state farms. Because for the first time in modern memory, people felt like the country belonged to them. That spirit couldn't be taxed. It couldn't be sanctioned. It couldn't be ignored, and yet, the pressure intensified. Global credit rating agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's score, despite growing internal productivity and reduced corruption. News networks called it a nation choosing pride over progress. But the people had learned something powerful. Progress defined by someone else's metrics isn't always progress. One elderly woman put it best in a town hall meeting: they measure what we borrow, not what we survive. The moment became a movement. Quotes from regular citizens were painted on city walls. Youth theater groups performed plays titled "The Loan That Never Helped." A public art installation showed a stack of shredded IMF paperwork turned into seed paper and planted with native crops. The world kept watching, some with fear, others with admiration, but no one could look away. Because when a people rise not with revenge, but with reason, not with case, but with clarity, it shakes not just governments. It shakes assumptions, and those tremors were growing stronger. The bell that echoed. Not the end, but the beginning. It wasn't a revolution of bullets, it was a revolution of choices. And by the time the last box of seized ammunition was melted, Burkina Faso had become something the world didn't expect. A nation that said no without shouting, rebuilt without begging, and led without permission. On the anniversary of the midnight interception, the capital gathered. No fireworks, no parades, just a silence as steady as stone. Then a single bell rang. Cast from a former mortar shell, it hung in the heart of Independence Square. Its sound wasn't loud, but it carried. Children stood with hands over hearts. Elders held each other, veterans saluted without command. And from that bell's echo rose a promise, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation that has ever been told to stay small. President Traoré approached the podium. He didn't read from notes, he didn't stand behind glass, he stood among the people. "We are not asking for recognition," he said. "We are reclaiming what was always ours, our dignity, our decisions, and our direction." He paused, looked at the crowd. "They told us weapons would give us security. We chose schools. They told us debt would bring us progress. We planted instead. They said we were isolated. We found each other." The crowd did not cheer. It listened. Because something had shifted, not just in policy or economy, but in identity. The people were no longer seeking inclusion in systems that exploited them. They were building new ones, and they understood something few dared to say aloud. Sometimes healing begins when you stop asking for rescue. The final act of the ceremony was quiet. From the stage, small boxes were handed out. Inside each, a shard of melted steel, labeled not by caliber but by purpose. Desk leg, water pump valve, sewing machine pedal, hospital bed wheel. They were more than tokens. They were proof of what had been done, of what had been overcome. As the sun set, the bell rang again. Far away in cafes and classrooms, in homes across the diaspora, it was heard. Not in sound, but in spirit. In Harlem, an old man watching the live stream stood and said, "I never thought I'd live to see this." In Dakar, a university student rewrote her thesis, from aid policy to cultural independence. In the Caribbean, a calypso artist wrote a song with the chorus, "They rang the bell so we could rise." And in Burkina Faso, no one asked what came next, because they knew. There would be storms again. There would be pressure, propaganda, and pain. But this time, they had something no one could confiscate, memory made of metal, pride melted into purpose, and a bell that could never be unrung. Because once a nation reclaims its story, it doesn't just change the ending, it rewrites the beginning.